Sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred isn't violence or revenge. It's forcing someone to face the mirror of their own prejudice. This is a story about how one teacher's bigotry led to her greatest lesson, and how a 15-year-old girl's quiet dignity brought an entire school to its knees. September 15th, 2023. The silence in classroom 10B was deafening. 28 pairs of eyes darted nervously between Ms. Patricia Whitmore and the new student, Jasmine Carter, who stood frozen at the whiteboard, marker trembling in her hand. "I asked you a simple question about European history." Ms. Whitmore's voice dripped with condescension. "Your continued silence only proves my point about certain students being, shall we say, out of their depth in advanced placement classes." Jasmine's shoulders tensed, but she kept her chin high. After 3 weeks of subtle jabs, thinly veiled insults, and random calls to the board that somehow always landed on her, she learned to wear her dignity like armor. "Maybe if you spent less time on your interesting hairstyle choices and more time studying, you wouldn't be embarrassing yourself right now," Ms. Whitmore continued, her lips curling into a smirk. What Ms. Whitmore couldn't know, was that at that exact moment, Dr. Marcus Carter was standing just outside the classroom door, his hand frozen mid-reach for the handle. The newly appointed principal of Lancaster Prep had come to surprise his daughter by sitting in on one of her classes. But sometimes the universe has its own plans for justice. 3 months earlier, June 2023. Dr. Marcus Carter stood in his new office, running his fingers along the polished mahogany desk that now belonged to him. After 15 years of teaching, followed by a decade in educational administration, he'd finally achieved his dream, becoming the principal of one of the most prestigious private schools in New England. Lancaster Preparatory Academy had a storied history spanning over 150 years. Its halls had educated Supreme Court justices, senators, and CEOs. It was also, as Marcus was painfully aware, a school that had only begun accepting students of color in the 1960s and still struggled with diversity in both its student body and faculty. That was about to change. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Jasmine asked, sitting in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. At 15, she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years, her dark eyes serious as she considered the situation. "I could stay at my old school. My friends are there, and the teachers know me." Marcus walked around the desk and knelt beside his daughter's chair. "Jazzy, this school has some of the best academic programs in the country. The opportunities here, they're incredible. And yes, I know it might be challenging being one of the few black students, but that's exactly why we need to be here," Jasmine finished, a small smile playing at her lips. It was their family motto, passed down from her grandmother, a civil rights activist. Be where they don't expect you to be, excel where they don't want you to succeed. What neither of them knew then was just how much that philosophy would be tested in the months to come. First day of school, September 2023. Jasmine adjusted her uniform blazer one last time before entering Ms. Whitmore's AP European History class. The first 2 periods of her day had gone surprisingly well. Her calculus teacher seemed impressed by her advanced math placement, and her English literature instructor had practically beamed when Jasmine referenced Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own during class discussion. But something felt different the moment she stepped into room 10B. Ms. Patricia Whitmore, a tall woman with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, paused mid-sentence as Jasmine entered. Her pale blue eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and her welcome seemed to freeze on her lips. "Ah, yes, the new student." Ms. Whitmore consulted her roster with exaggerated care. "Jasmine Carter, is it? This is Advanced Placement European History. Are you quite sure you're in the right classroom?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine replied clearly, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "I have my schedule right here if you'd like to verify." Ms. Whitmore's lips thinned. "That won't be necessary. Please take a seat. Though I should warn you, this is a very rigorous course. We maintain extremely high standards here at Lancaster Prep." The emphasis on high standards wasn't subtle. Neither was the way Ms. Whitmore's gaze lingered disapprovingly on Jasmine's meticulously maintained box braids. As Jasmine took her seat, she didn't know that this moment was just the beginning. She couldn't have predicted how over the next 3 weeks, Ms. Whitmore would gradually escalate from subtle digs to outright hostility. The random pop quizzes that seemed to target her, the way her raised hand was consistently ignored, the snide comments about certain cultures, lacking the background to truly appreciate European history. And she certainly couldn't have known that it would all come to a head on that fateful September morning, with her father standing outside the classroom door, about to witness something that would shake Lancaster Preparatory Academy to its very foundations. Dr. Marcus Carter had planned to simply observe his daughter's class quietly. It was something he liked to do occasionally as principal, dropping in unannounced to various classrooms to get a real sense of the teaching dynamics at Lancaster Prep. But as he stood there, hands still hovering over the door handle, Miss Whitmore's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a different level of history class," she was saying, each word precise and cutting. "One that focuses on simpler concepts. After all, we can't expect everyone to grasp the nuances of European civilization." Inside the classroom, Jasmine stood at the whiteboard, her back straight as steel. The question written above her head was about the political implications of the Treaty of Westphalia, a topic she'd actually discussed with her father just last week during one of their regular dinner conversations about history. But that wasn't the point. The point was the way Miss Whitmore's words dripped with assumptions and prejudice, the way she'd been systematically attempting to break down a 15-year-old girl's confidence and sense of belonging. What happened next would be talked about in Lancaster Prep's halls for years to come. Jasmine turned to face Ms. Whitmore, her voice clear and steady. The Treaty of Westphalia, signed in 1648, established the principle of state sovereignty in international law. It ended both the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of Europe. Its concepts of state sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs became cornerstones of modern international relations. She paused, then added, "But I suspect, Ms. Whitmore, that you're less interested in my knowledge of European history than you are in making assumptions based on the color of my skin." The class collectively gasped. Ms. Whitmore's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you accuse me of—" she began, but she never finished that sentence, because that was the moment the classroom door opened, and Dr. Marcus Carter stepped in. The look of confusion on Ms. Whitmore's face quickly morphed into horror as she recognized the school's new principal, and noticed the striking resemblance between him and the student she'd been tormenting for weeks. "Please continue, Ms. Whitmore," Dr. Carter said quietly, his calm voice carrying more weight than any shout. "You were about to respond to my daughter's accurate assessment of both the Treaty of Westphalia and your classroom conduct." The silence that followed was absolute. The next few minutes in classroom 10B unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Ms. Whitmore's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, embarrassment, fear, and finally a desperate attempt at damage control. "Dr. Carter," she stammered, smoothing her already immaculate blazer, I was simply maintaining academic standards. Surely as an educator yourself, you understand the importance of what exactly?" Dr. Carter's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Of assuming a student's capabilities based on their appearance? Of systematic harassment disguised as academic rigor?" The other students sat in stunned silence, many recording the scene on their phones despite school policies against it. By lunch period, the video would be circulating throughout the school. By dinner, it would reach the parent groups. By the next morning, local news stations would be asking for comments. But right now, in this moment, there was just a father, a daughter, and a teacher whose career was unraveling with each passing second. "This is a PR nightmare," Board Member Thompson declared, pacing the conference room later that afternoon. "We've already received calls from 3 major news outlets, and the Parents Association is in an uproar." Dr. Carter sat calmly at the head of the table, a position he'd earned but never expected to use quite like this. Beside him, Jasmine sat straight-backed, having just finished giving her account of the past 3 weeks. "A nightmare of our own making," Dr. Carter replied. "Lancaster Prep has swept issues like this under the rug for too long. Maybe it's time we face them head on. Board member Patricia Wellington, who'd been quietly taking notes, looked up. Marcus, Dr. Carter, while what happened is inexcusable, perhaps we could handle this internally? Ms. Whitmore has been with us for 20 years. 20 years of what? Jasmine's voice surprised everyone. She rarely spoke in front of the board, but when she did, she commanded attention, just like her father. 20 years of making students feel less than? Because in 3 weeks, I've heard stories from other minority students. They were just too afraid to speak up. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Over the next few days, something extraordinary happened at Lancaster Preparatory Academy. What started as one incident in one classroom cracked open a dam of long-suppressed stories. Sarah Chen, a senior, came forward about how Ms. Whitmore had suggested she take regular history instead of AP, despite her perfect grades. Muhammad al-Rahman revealed how she'd repeatedly mispronounced his name, even after countless corrections, always with that same dismissive smirk. But it wasn't just about Ms. Whitmore anymore. Students began sharing other experiences. Subtle discriminations, casual racism, systemic biases that had become so normalized they were almost invisible. Like water wearing away at rock, these small injustices had shaped the school's culture, creating an environment where some students felt they had to work twice as hard to be considered half as good. A week after the incident, Dr. Carter called an all-school assembly. The usual chatter that filled Lancaster Prep's historic auditorium was notably absent as he took the stage. Many of you have seen the video, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Some of you were there, but what happened in room 10B isn't just about one teacher or one student. It's about who we are as an institution, and more importantly, who we want to be. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, faces of every color, though not in the proportions that reflected the world outside Lancaster Prep's gates. Ms. Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but firing one teacher won't solve the deeper issues we face. Today we're announcing several changes. The changes he outlined were significant. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all faculty and staff, the establishment of a student-led diversity council, a review of curriculum to ensure it reflected diverse perspectives, and a new anonymous reporting system for students to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. But perhaps most importantly, he continued, we need to acknowledge that excellence knows no color, no creed, no background. The only barriers to achievement should be the ones we set for ourselves, not the ones others place in our path. That evening, Jasmine found her father in his office, still working long after most had gone home. "Dad," she said softly, settling into what had become her usual chair, "do you think anything will really change?" Dr. Carter looked up from his papers, studying his daughter's face. In the past week, he'd seen her grow in ways that made his heart both swell with pride and ache with parental concern. Change isn't a moment, Jazzy. It's a process. What happened with Ms. Whitmore? That was a moment. What happens next? That's the change. Jasmine nodded, then asked the question that had been bothering her. Some people are saying I planned it, that I set her up because I'm your daughter. Dr. Carter's expression darkened momentarily. And what do you think about that? I think, Jasmine said slowly, that they're missing the point. Whether I was your daughter or not, what she did was wrong. Being your daughter just meant she got caught. And that's exactly why we're here, Dr. Carter smiled, echoing their earlier conversation. To be where they don't expect us to be, and excel where they don't want us to succeed, Jasmine finished, a small smile playing at her lips. 6 months later, the changes at Lancaster Prep didn't happen overnight, but they happened. Ms. Whitmore, after a thorough investigation, resigned rather than face termination. The story made regional news, sparking discussions at other private schools about their own policies and practices. The Student Diversity Council, led by a coalition of students including Jasmine, became one of the most active organizations on campus. They organized cultural awareness events, started mentorship programs, and created safe spaces for students to share their experiences and concerns. But perhaps the most significant change was in the daily life of the school. The hallways felt different, more open, more inclusive. Students who had once felt invisible began to find their voices. Teachers who had been silent allies became active advocates. One morning, as Jasmine walked to her new European history class, now taught by Dr. Rodriguez, a brilliant historian with a passion for showing how European history interconnected with global events, she passed Miss Whitmore's old classroom. The room had been reassigned to the Student Diversity Council as their meeting space. On the wall outside, they'd hung a simple plaque with a quote from Jasmine's grandmother: "Be where they don't expect you to be, excel where they don't want you to succeed. But most importantly, when you make it through that door, hold it open for others to follow." And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all. Years later, when asked about the incident that changed Lancaster Prep, Dr. Carter would always say the same thing. It wasn't about bringing one teacher down, it was about lifting an entire community up. Jasmine, who went on to graduate as valedictorian before attending Yale, put it differently in her graduation speech. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or planned movements. Sometimes it comes from simply standing your ground, knowing your worth, and refusing to let anyone define your capabilities based on their prejudices. But most importantly, it comes from turning moments of injustice into opportunities for growth, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. The video from that day in room 10B occasionally still surfaces on social media, usually accompanied by discussions about systemic racism in education and the importance of speaking up. But at Lancaster Prep, it's remembered not for the controversy it caused, but for the conversations it started and the changes it inspired. As for Ms. Whitmore, she never returned to teaching. Instead, she became an unlikely advocate for educational reform, speaking openly about her own journey of confronting and addressing internalized biases. Her story became a different kind of lesson, one about the possibility of growth and change, even in those who seem most resistant to it. In the end, what happened in room 10B wasn't just about a racist teacher and a principal's daughter. It was about the moment when an institution was forced to look in the mirror and decide what kind of reflection it wanted to see. It was about the courage it takes to stand up, the wisdom to learn from mistakes, and the commitment required to turn a single moment of justice into lasting change. And somewhere, in a frame on Dr. Carter's office wall, there's a simple photograph. Jasmine at her graduation, surrounded by a diverse group of friends, all wearing honor cords, all smiling, all proving that excellence truly knows no bounds.